It's not enough to just play the right notes, and like me, you probably found that out the hard way. Let me show you 5 jazz licks that teach you how to make the notes sound right, and explain how you get that into your solos, because just playing the right notes will never be enough. If you're working on soloing over changes, you might sound something like this. But when you listen to great solos, then there are 3 things missing. The 5 licks in this video will show you how to add those things and fix that, using stuff that you already know. This first step takes something that you're already using and makes it sound 10 times better. Skipping this often makes your solos lack rhythm and energy, and with this tweak you can fix that. Now, one of the most common ways to sound correct but still boring is playing arpeggios or chord tones with no rhythmic or melodic shape. It is the easiest way to kill a solo. I really struggled with this when I was getting started. I knew my solos didn't sound right, but I couldn't figure out how to fix it. Barry Harris gave me a solution, and it changed everything. Now, one of the mornings in the Barry Harris workshop in The Hague back in 1998, he told us to play a major scale from the root up to the 7th. I don't remember if he used this exact scale, but that's also not the point. Next, he told us to play the C major 7 arpeggio. And here he also pointed out that you actually have an arpeggio on every step of the scale, and you of course need to know all of them. So he asked us to play all the diatonic arpeggios. Now, this was incredibly useful, but it wasn't yet that mind-blowing in terms of getting solos to sound like great jazz lines. But of course, Barry Harris managed to turn this into a much more inspiring sound. He told us to put a half step before the C major 7 arpeggio and play the arpeggio as a triplet, which was this melody. And this immediately sounds like what I heard in Charlie Parker and Joe Pass solos all the time. Not surprisingly, the next exercise was of course to take this through the scale. When you play diatonic arpeggios like this, you add more energy to the solo, like this. I'm starting on the 3rd E, and then with a passing note moving down to the D, so. Then I'm skipping down to the B, and this becomes the chromatic lead note for the arpeggio, so we have the B, and then I go into the triplet arpeggio, and then go down 1 step in the scale. And notice that I'm ending this line on a forehand because it feels much lighter to end solo lines on short notes and also often to end on an offbeat. Now let's explore the problem that all jazz beginners run into with their phrasing. Here's one thing that you don't want to have too much of in your solos. If I play this, then you can already hear this coming. It's too predictable, which is a problem and makes it boring. You want your solo to make sense, but also surprise the listener. Keep it fresh and interesting. Now, a lot of beginner jazz solos tend to sound like this. Even though the notes are right, the line is still boring, and there are 2 main problems. It changes direction only on the heavy beats, so beat 1 and 3, and it moves too much in a predictable stepwise motion. But how do you fix this? Now, this video has a few different solutions, but this one is the easiest to get started with. First, I'm gonna show you a simple exercise, and then I'll give you a recipe to start using it in your own solos. For a C major triad, that gives you this. So here B is of course both diatonic and chromatic. Around the 3rd E, you have F and D sharp. Around the 5th G, you get A and F sharp. And that gives you this exercise. Since this is about melodic direction, it also helps to reverse the order of the enclosure. The way you want to start using this is pretty simple. Focus on the triad of the chord. So for our C major 7, that's easy, just use the C major triad. The recipe is start with a chord tone and then play an enclosure around the next chord tone. If you use that recipe and also add a triplet arpeggio, you can create lines like this. There are 2 enclosures here. I start on a chord tone, the 5th G, and then add an enclosure around the E. And since that's a chord tone, then I follow that up with another enclosure around the C. And then of course that becomes the triplet arpeggio. The difference is that the melody skips around a lot more and doesn't just move predictably in one direction all the time. And whenever it skips around, it comes back to a chord tone so that it makes sense to the ear. Now let's explore another approach to arpeggios that adds more character to your solos. Let me save you a lot of time. A mistake I definitely made, and that I see lots of students make, is focusing too much on arpeggio inversions. In jazz, we often explore a lot of different ways to play the same thing, just like how we used 2 versions of the enclosure exercise earlier. And yes, triad inversions show up in jazz solos, but when you start checking out real solos, you'll notice something. 7th chord inversions are actually pretty rare. I didn't realize this when I was starting out, so I spent a ton of time practicing 7th chord inversions, and I really struggled to make them sound good in my solos. They're not completely useless, but once I started practicing diatonic arpeggios and the Barry Harris exercises, I completely stopped working on inversions. But that doesn't mean you always play arpeggios the same way. You already saw how rhythm, like using a triplet, makes a big difference. And here's another variation that's a lot more musical and that you hear all the time in great solos. Start with a basic C major 7 arpeggio and notice that I'm adding a scale note after it. Now take the first note, the C, and then move that up an octave. This gives you this beautiful large interval skip. You can do this with every diatonic arpeggio, and this is a great exercise. Here I'm playing it a bit fast, but you can of course just grab the PDF on my website and try it for yourself. This adds a lot more excitement to your solo lines. This sounds a lot more complicated than it is, and it actually makes a lot of sense to the ear, which also makes it easier to play, and the big intervals really open up your lines and add more excitement. These examples are all on C major 7, but of course the principle works on other chords as well. Now let's bring in some chromatic notes, because that's where things really start sounding like jazz. You've already seen chromatic notes in the enclosures, but there's a lot more you can do with half-step approaches and really bring your lines to life. There aren't any hard rules when it comes to using chromatic notes, but Barry Harris has a really great system for this, and it's a perfect starting point if you want to create beautiful bebop lines. Let me show you how this works in C major. This is C major from C to C. Now adding a half step between C and D is easy because we have a C sharp, so same between D and E. We can just use the D sharp, but how do you fit a note in between E and F? Now this is where Barry's approach comes in. You take the scale note above the target. So to go from E to F, you add a G before the F. So now it sounds a bit odd as a rule, but as a melody, this really works. You'll see. From F to G, we have a half step, G to A the same, and also from A to B. Now between B and C, again, there's no half step, so we take the scale note above, that's the D. That gives you this scale. The descending version of this is the same, which means that you still use the note above. And notice that I tend to choose where to play the chromatic note depending on where it's resolving to. So ascending and descending are not identical in terms of fingering, because I use the C sharp here to go up to D, but I use the D flat here to go down to C. For me, that was just always more practical, but that might be different for you. The cool thing is that once you understand this, you can move around chromatic phrases in the scale and they still sound logical. Let's say that you have a lick with a C major triad and a chromatic run. Now this is a chromatic run from B down to G. And of course then we have a descending C major triad, so G down to C. Now if you move that up a third in the scale, then you would start on D, and then you will get this chromatic run. And then of course you would then continue down the E minor triad. So you can move all chromatic melodies around in the scale and get licks that not only make sense rhythmically, but also just sound really solid as lines. I have another video diving into this concept and exploring it in more depth, and I'll link to that in the video description. With this, the licks that you can make are getting pretty hip for just being C major 7. So you have a pivot arpeggio, followed by half steps between A and G. Then I'm skipping down to the E. I'm going further down to the D where I'm connecting in half steps, so. And then ending on a low G. Now let's get into something that really adds surprises to your solos. Octave displacement. This lick was giving me a lot of trouble when I was starting to check out bebop lines. At the time I'd never heard of pivot arpeggios or octave displacement, but I clearly remember coming across this incredibly beautiful yet simple line. Now if eventually I figured out that it was essentially just a descending scale run with a part of it moved an octave. So it came from this. But when I tried to move the melody an octave in a different place, it didn't work at all. But it did work if I used a diminished arpeggio on the G7 instead of the scale run. And I could also use a pivot arpeggio version of that arpeggio, even if it resolves to a different note. As you can see, pivot arpeggios are a specific type of octave displacement, but all of this is difficult to use on a major 7 chord. Now, if you start to check out classical music, and especially more dense melodies like Bach, you'll find octave displacement all over the place. But here, I want to focus on other examples that you can easily use. And one example that sounds amazing on a major 7 chord is a transformation of this common Am7, C major 7 melody. Here you can move the E down an octave to get this really melodic interval skip. And if you put that to use, then you get something like this. Another great place where you can use that transformation is this similar melody. And that becomes this. And if you combine that with the triplet arpeggios, enclosures, and chromatic runs from earlier, then you get a line like this. Another way to explain these great intervallic melodies is what I cover in this video, together with a deeper exploration of Barry Harris' chromatic scale. This is a powerful tool for upgrading your solos that will do amazing things for your phrasing. Now, without that, you'll never sound like jazz. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.